So hello, everyone, and welcome to Ollie at BCC's online program, Ukraine, Gateway to Europe. My name is Megan Weldon, and it's my honor to be the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College, or Ollie for short. For those who are new to us, we are a member-based program with over 1,400 members in the Berkshires and far beyond. We offer stimulating educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years and better, but open to all. For more information on our programs, you can visit our website at berkshireollie.org. As I mentioned earlier, tonight's program is in Zoom's webinar format, which means your camera and microphone are off. We encourage questions and comments, but we have over 1,000 people who have registered for tonight. So we ask that you put your comments and questions in the chat for Jim. And after his talk, John Dixon will help him moderate those, and we'll have a great discussion. I am absolutely sure. Also note that we have the live transcript feature on for those who find it helpful. If you prefer not to see it, simply go to the bottom of your screen in most cases and click on the CC icon where it says live transcript, and you can choose turn off transcript or vice versa. For those who have raised their hands, we can't call on people that way, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll be happy to help. So Ollie is very much volunteer powered. It's our members themselves who create and often lead our programs. And we are pleased to welcome Jim Brooke as one of our newest members. Welcome, Jim. He will be introduced by another extraordinary Ollie member, John Dixon, who is currently leading a course called Conversations with Berkshire Historians for Ollie, and will lead a Great Decisions course this spring as well. So I hand over the imaginary microphone to John to introduce Jim.
Thank you very much, Megan, and good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Very pleased to be able to introduce to you all Jim Brooke tonight. I'm sure one of the reasons there are so many people who signed up was the very brief bio that was put in the invitation that attests to why he's uniquely qualified to talk about the subject that we have tonight and why it's so pertinent and relevant and timely right now. I only recently met Jim, but as we spoke, we discovered we probably should have met years ago, as our paths seem to have crossed on four different continents, but never really at the same time. But they do now, and they've crossed in the Berkshires. Jim is a Berkshire native. He grew up in Lenox. And after graduating from Yale, he entered the world of journalism with an urge to be a foreign correspondent, capitalizing on his mastery at that young age of foreign languages. For almost 20 years, he served as a foreign correspondent with the New York Times in Brazil, Canada, West Africa, and Tokyo and Seoul. He did some business consulting in Russia and the former Soviet Union before signing on as a correspondent for the Voice of America for Russia. He moved to Kyiv, as we now pronounce it, as we learned a couple of years ago in impeachment hearings. He was editor-in-chief of 2 business journals there. He recently relocated back home here to Lenox, but continues to serve as an editor of the online Ukraine Financial News. His extended personal experiences in both Moscow and Kyiv give Jim a unique vantage point to comment on the current situation along the Ukraine border and its ripple effects across Europe, Asia, and North America. Thank you very much, Jim, for offering to do this. Jim, I do have a map on my screen. If you want me to share that at any point, just let me know and I'll be happy.
Yeah, that would be great. And thank you, John, for that lovely intro. And thank you, Megan. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad so many people are interested in Ukraine. As John mentioned, basically, I'm coming to you having spent 8 years in Moscow and then 6 years in Kyiv. So I really know both sides of the coin pretty well. I think my value add today will be to talk about where the Ukrainian people are and where their mentality is. But first of all, it's a very fast moving story. We learned a few hours ago that the Russian Navy, starting Sunday, essentially will blockade all Ukrainian ports. This is very, very serious. Now they may back down a little bit, but about 80% of Ukraine's international trade goes through its Black Sea and Sea of Azov ports. There's no legal justification for this, and it really is an act of war. And hopefully we're not going to get to real war. But I think what Putin is up to is he's looking for sort of not painless, let's say painful, but invisible ways of strangling and subduing Ukraine. And one way is to strangle the foreign trade. This obviously runs up insurance costs, et cetera. In the past, drones have blown up ammo dumps, ammunition dumps, way out of sight of people. No one's really been hurt, but they've lost a lot of ammunition that way. So things are moving fast, and this story is really much more important than Ukraine. The Chinese are watching very closely, and if the West kind of steps on the ball and doesn't defend Ukraine, guess what's going to happen to Taiwan? And I think the Biden administration understands that there's a lot more at stake here than just simply Ukraine. Putin in his latest press conference came out with this pretty bizarre comment. Addressing Ukrainians, he said, "Like it or not, my beauty, you have to put up with it." Some people interpreted that as a rape comment, and I think it's fairly appropriate. The Ukrainians have moved on. They've moved beyond Russia. They've turned their back to Russia. They don't want to be part of Russia. And I will now get into why that's happened. And there are three elements here. One is the church, the other is the language, and the other is the army. In case you forgot, in 1685, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church came under the rule of the Patriarch in Moscow. That lasted for 3 centuries and change until 3 years ago. Now the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for the first time in over 3 centuries, is independent. It does not answer to Moscow. It's an independent force. And most of the parishes have migrated to answering to Kyiv and not to Moscow. What pushed this religious split partly was that the Moscow oriented priests refused to give final rights to the men coming back from the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers killed in the war. So Moscow has lost the church, and I don't see that coming back. Language is crucial. On one level, Kyiv, as we pronounce it, is the largest Russian-speaking city outside of Russia. That said, it's largely a bilingual city. And the fact that I'm speaking to you in English does not mean that I'm a subject of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, Putin confuses language with nationality. He does not and has been unable to get his head around the very simple fact that there are millions of Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriots. These are people whose native language is Russian and do not want to be part of Russia. Now, the Ukrainian language is very similar. It's like Portuguese and Spanish. They're very similar languages. It's not a dialect. It's actually linguistically closer to Polish than to Russian. Since independence, 30 years ago, 1991, the law has been that all K through university, kindergarten through university, has to be instructed in, taught in Ukrainian. That's been phased in. And now, basically, everybody under 40 is fluent in Ukrainian. And many people in Western Ukraine do not speak Russian. And it's not a political statement. They just don't speak Russian. And even if you shout at them in Russian, they don't speak Russian. They speak Polish, or they speak Ukrainian, but their second language might be Polish or German. Ukraine is one of the largest countries for studying German in the world. But this Ukrainian language growth is really impressive. A year ago, by law, whenever you walk into a store in Kyiv or in Ukraine, they have to address you first in Ukrainian. And then in my case, I say, "Excuse me, I don't speak Ukrainian. Could we talk in Russian?" I read Ukrainian, but I don't speak it. And there are different languages once again. I could say, "Я розмовляю по-украински," or "Я говорю по-русски." That's just two different languages. I speak Ukrainian or I speak Russian, different languages. It's not a dialect. And as I say, everyone in Ukraine under 40 by now is bilingual. The Soviet generation is not, and they tend to be Russian speaking. And often inside a family, the kids will speak Ukrainian among themselves. They might speak Ukrainian with their parents. And when they talk to their grandmother, the babushka, they might talk to her in Russian. Ukrainians are very bilingual people. I remember talking to a woman, she told me she couldn't remember, she watched a movie last night, she couldn't remember which language it was in. I mean, it's just very sort of stereophonic. All billboards, all public signs have to be in Ukrainian, and they are. All menus are in Ukrainian or English, or both. You can be fined if you have a menu in Russian. You can be, definitely cannot have a public sign in Russian. So Russian has kind of receded to a kitchen language, which does engender some resentment among some Russian speakers, generally the older generation. The younger people are quite proud of the Ukrainian language, and so they like it. Now, Putin views this as, it's kind of hard to believe, but he believes the Ukrainian language was a project of the Austrian-Hungarian military intelligence in the 19th century. It's a full-fledged language, with its own Shakespeare and its own poetry and its own novels, and he believes it was a plot by Vienna. So basically, the teaching of Ukrainian in Russia is virtually banned. When I lived in Moscow, I used to walk past the Ukrainian Cultural Center that's been closed. The librarian of the Ukrainian library was arrested. I mean, it's really, it's like the 1870s, the way the Russian government sees Ukrainian language. A second item close to language is the attraction of Western soft power. Before COVID hit, more people traveled by train for the first time in history to train west than to north, than to Russia. The whole railroad system was built under the Czars to feed people through Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there's a rail gauge break for different sizes to the rail. Former Soviet Union is one size, and EU is another size. So you see, where are people going? Where are they traveling? Where are they vacationing? Where are they studying? Where are they working? You have 1 million Ukrainians working in Poland now. Poland has far and away surpassed Russia as the source of foreign remittances, wage remittances. I moved to Kyiv in 2015 and thought I'd see a lot of my friends from Moscow. I didn't see, no one came down. No one ever came. That year, they stopped direct flights. There are no direct commercial flights between Ukraine and Russia for the last 7 years. So people have really turned their back, while the mothers and definitely the grandmothers, they've all been to Lenin's tomb, they've all been to Leningrad. There's a whole generation going up that have never been to Russia and really don't care, and have very uncomfortable conversations with their cousins in Russia because they've just moved in different directions. You see it in the Kyiv metro and the subway line, subway system. These signs, take a bus to Warsaw for $20. I mean, anyone can go to the EU. And starting about 4 years ago, Ukrainians can go to the EU, European Union, visa-free for 90 days every 6 months. So there's a huge amount of informal travel for vacation, and as I said, for work. And I remember a case where a friend of mine is a British lawyer in Warsaw. He said he had a Ukrainian maid they'd pass the baton every 6 months, and it might be Natasha, and then Yana would come in at the end of the 6 months. Very informal. And so Ukrainians feel very comfortable in the EU, and they're generally welcomed for their labor and for their euros, for their vacationing. So until COVID hit, Ryanair, Wizz Air, you could fly from Kyiv to 40 EU capitals. So you couldn't fly to Russia, but you could fly west to 40 cities in the EU. Very big thing. Now, let's look at the army, which unfortunately may be the issue of the moment. we in the US, we think, oh, it's not really a Russian war or it's a civil war or something. Ukrainians see it as in 2014, Russia attacked them, and it did. It seized Crimea, which for American terms is like stealing Florida. And they not only annexed it, but they stole all the property, the nightclubs, the apartments, the vacation houses, the hotels, the restaurants. I remember when I moved to Kyiv in 2015, a woman told me that after the annexation, she went back to try to reopen her beach bar, and she was sort of dusting things off and setting up the sound system. And 3 guys showed up and said, "You got 15 minutes to get out of here. It's ours." And so it was not just the transfer of sovereignty, which wasn't recognized by anyone outside of Russia, but it was the physical stealing of property of the Florida of Ukraine. It was the warmest part of the country. So they see this as a Russian attack on Ukraine that started 8 years ago. So if you take it from the Ukrainian point of view, the army has 8 years of frontline experience in the trenches fighting Russia, and they've lost about 14,000 people in the process. The Ukrainian armed forces are the second largest in Europe. They are now 250,000 men and women. Women are very important. And of these 250,000, a lot have battlefield experience. There are 200,000 reservists. They're forming a self-defense militia guard for partisan warfare. I talked to a friend of mine in Kyiv, and he said that his date had canceled for Saturday because she's going out for sniper lessons. 50% of Ukrainians say they will actively resist a Russian attack. And this comes as they're the defenders. They're defending their own land. And it's not a surprise. This sort of Putin striptease about putting military pressure on greater Ukraine has been going on since last March. So it's not a big surprise for people. Going back to the army on the ground, the British Army has 227 tanks. The Ukrainian army has 2,500. It has 10 times as many tanks, 12,000 armored combat vehicles. So this isn't a pushover army by any means. They're very good at drones because IT in Ukraine is very strong. And they've got a relationship with Turkey, Turkey does not want the Black Sea to become a Russian lake. And now that John's put up the map, you can see there's Ukraine. To the west is Romania, which is a staunch NATO ally. South of that is Bulgaria, which is a sort of lukewarm NATO ally. South of that is Turkey, which is a long-serving founding member of NATO. So, and then to the right, to the southeast is Georgia, which is a NATO candidate country. So these 4 countries do not want Russia to control the Black Sea, which Russia is busy doing. Back to the military and behind the military is public opinion. When I first went to Ukraine 15 years ago, 2006 or so, 2007, the public opinion polls were kind of odd. 1/3 of the respondents were happy with Ukraine being independent. 1/3 wanted to be part of the Soviet Union, too late. And 1/3 wanted to be part of Russia. By driving your tanks into someone else's country, surprise, surprise, they get their backs up. And Putin's military attacks on Ukraine starting 8 years ago have really strengthened Ukrainian nationalism. And the latest polls show that 68% would like to join NATO and 75% would like to join the EU. Now, neither of these things are going to happen, but it's a measure of where the 40 million Ukrainians, where their heads are. And one's going back to my earlier thought that they've moved beyond Russia and they've turned their backs to Russia, and Putin has lost the hearts and minds of the Ukrainians. So if you go back 8 years, these, you may not have heard of these people's republics that Putin got going in half of 2 regions, and tried in Odessa and tried in Kharkiv, and it didn't work. And that was attractive to some people for linguistic reasons, economic reasons. Oh, boy, we'll be taken over by rich Russia. They'll pick up our pensions. It'll be great. That was then. Now is now. 8 years later, these people's republics are disasters. Half the population is left. No one from Ukraine has migrated into these places. They're run by gangsters, essentially. They have torture camps, especially in Donetsk. And there's no freedom press, there's no election, there's nothing like that. So these are disaster zones, and Ukrainians have had 8 years to observe them and to talk to people who've escaped from them, and they don't want to be any part of it. The sort of dreamy, fuzzy thinking of maybe 2013, well, we'd be better off with Russia, that's gone, that's over. Then you've had, since the 2014, we call the Revolution of Dignity, a really thoroughgoing decommunization. There's this fascinating phenomenon called Leninpad, which means Lenin fall, sort of like waterfall. And over 8 years, all 1,300 Lenin statues have been taken down. And there's a wonderful Swiss photographer who documented what's happened to these things. And, one is holding up a carport, another is in the basement of a museum, another is just sort of face down in a flower bed or something. So every single Lenin statue has been taken down in Ukraine, with the exception of 2 in Chernobyl, the former Soviet nuclear power plant area. And they're kind of kept up as part of the Soviet theme park. A lot of Western tourists like to go to Chernobyl. It's about an hour and a half north of Kyiv. And so the Lenin statues are there. But all the communist street names, village names, they've all been changed. There's a massive education of the Holodomor, which is when the Soviets deliberately starved 3 to 4 million Ukrainians to bring them into submission. That was in 32, 33. There's also a crop of movies, some funded by the government, that really glorify the partisan warfare of the 1944 to 1954 period. This is a very little known factoid, but during that decade, 44 to 54, more Soviet security personnel were killed in Western Ukraine than during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. So the meek and mild Ukrainians, you don't really want to push them too far, or you're going to run into problems. And these partisan armies have been glorified. Their heroes have been put on as street names. There are just lots of movies. The surviving veterans are trundled out and given pensions and awards. It's a very widespread sort of appreciation of these men and women who died. And so we've had 7, 8 years of these movies. I think for Putin's side, Ukraine is essentially an existential threat. Ukraine is a Slavic, multi-party, free market democracy. That doesn't fit with Russia, with Putin's Russia. And that is a threat. And it's a real threat, and it's not some airy-fairy ideological discussion. He does not want to see a successful Ukraine. Don't forget that Russia has no elections for mayors or for governors. And obviously the economy is totally corrupt. I once asked a Russian, when do you think you'll reach the political maturity of Brazilians and elect your own mayors and governors? And he almost punched me, but that's the reality, that Russia is living in an authoritarian diktat system. And since they claim to be the older brothers of the Ukrainians, there's no difference between them, blah, blah, blah. Ukraine cannot be a successful free market democracy, period. So for Putin, that is a real threat. So on the Putin subject, he turns 70 this October. I'm sure everyone knows men who've turned 70, and they become concerned about their legacy. They're concerned about protecting their family wealth. People have calculated that Putin may be the richest man in the world. He'd like to pass some of that on to his daughters and sons-in-law. He doesn't want to end up like Ceausescu, shot behind a barn, or Gaddafi shot next to a drain pipe. And he also wants to, like many men in their 70s, he wants to protect his legacy. He does not want to go down in history as the Czar who lost Ukraine. Brzezinski said, Russia without Ukraine is not an empire. In the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the second largest, second richest of the 15 Soviet republics. It's the apple of their eye. It has a special feeling for Russians and for Putin especially. So this is his moment. And it may be this month. It could well be this month. These military exercises in Belarus end on February 20th, Sunday, February 20th. The Beijing Olympics are over on Sunday, February 20th. And by the way, I covered the Sochi Winter Olympics of 2014, and Putin waited until the Olympics were over and basically annexed Crimea the next day. He got in hot water with the Chinese because he invaded Georgia in the middle of the Beijing Summer Olympics of 2008. So he's kind of Olympic conscious. The other element is that the ground will start thawing at least by March 1st. And when the ground is frozen solid as it is now, you can zip around in rubber-wheeled armored personnel carriers and even tanks. And that becomes a lot tougher, especially when the ground melts and turns. The Russians, the Nazis called Ukraine in the spring a sea of mud. They just couldn't move anywhere. So when that happens, everyone's forced to go on the asphalt. And then the Ukrainians who have been busy teaching themselves how to make IEDs, these improvised explosives, can blow up armored personnel carriers as they come down the roads. So Putin would like to have free reign to run his vehicles over the hard ground in eastern Ukraine. So, and then I think in the long term, this is a different discussion, but fossil fuels are kind of going to become yesterday's energy, and this may be Russia's moment. And we think we do have some very tough sanctions lined up for Russia, but Russia has $500 billion in cash reserves, and it can run for a pretty long stretch of time without, under sanctions. So there's the question now is Putin, is it Vlad the rational, or is it Mad Vlad? I'd like to think it's Vlad the rational, who can add up everything and see the cost this will. Frankly, I think it'd be the end of his regime if he invaded Ukraine, but it would take, tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives and many years. But I think that'd be the end of his government. But Mad Vlad is surrounded by some pretty creepy advisors. Some that say they should retake Alaska. If you go to Washington to the National Archive, you will see a canceled check for $7.2 million, presumably signed by Tsar Alexander. We paid for Alaska. There's no debate about that. But the kind of people advising Putin who are saying that Ukrainian is a construct of Austrian-Hungarian military intelligence from the 1880s, and that, the check bounced for Alaska or whatever. These are the people who are advising Ukraine, Putin, and this whole Russian world thing. Anyone who speaks Russian should answer to the Kremlin. These are not terribly rational people. And I don't want to get in a different debate, but we as Americans, we've had several wars which we didn't do too well in, where the advisors were pushing our well-meaning presidents into. And, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan weren't really major victories. So it is very conceivable that the combination of bad advice and Putin's stage of life, where this is his window, that he could move in coming days. And I think a naval blockade may well start this weekend. So I think I'll leave it with that. I'm sure people have a lot of questions, and I'll leave John to kind of pick through them and relay them to me. I can't see your questions, so I'll just stand by and sip my Coke.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. And obviously, I heard a lot that I had never known before, and you made a great case for Ukraine looking west, and the majority of Ukraine looking west. We had a quick question about the map, which was what parts are now either under Russian control or autonomous, according to.
Well, simple answer is 7% of the Ukrainian landmass is controlled by Russia. 7. That's Crimea. And in the far eastern chunk, where you see all those little cities, half of 2 regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, are controlled by Russia. And it's sort of like World War I. It's trench warfare, and the lines have not moved essentially in 5 years.
And just starting down the list of questions here, because you did talk about the Army being on the front lines for 8 years, we are reading as well stories about the Ukrainian Army getting war weary and wanting this to end.
Sure, but they're defending their own land, and the Russians are not. There was an interesting survey of Russian men between 18 and 25, and they were overwhelmingly not interested in invading Ukraine. There was another open letter by a retired Russian general who heads a retired officers association, who said invading Ukraine would be stupid, would be negative, should not be done. And of course, 100 intellectuals signed a letter opposing this. So on the Russian side, even despite all total control of the media, Putin hasn't really been able to gin up a lot of interest, a lot of support. On the Ukrainian side, I think they're waiting. I think they know what's up, and they're sure they're war weary, but if they may see a fight, I think that's kind of energizes them. So I definitely don't count the Ukrainian army out. And military people say the ratio should be 2 to 1. If you really want to launch a full-fledged invasion of a country, you got to have 2 occupier invaders for every defender. So Russia may well do some spectacular advances at the outset, could take a couple of cities or something, but the Ukrainians saying things like there will be fire from every window. So you really don't want to be a Russian soldier. Now, that said, the Russians, I just read today, they're preparing field hospitals. They've got their military police in ready to do occupation duty. But, you don't want to be a Russian military policeman in Ukraine, because you'll be picked off pretty fast.
You made a case that Putin's primary motivation is recovery of Ukraine as part of the greater Russia. Is Putin also looking at, as part of his posturing, is to break up NATO, is to break this alliance between the United States and Europe? Is that just as good for him?
Yeah, I think once again, people seem to think that Putin is Teflon, but he's making another mistake because NATO seemed to be joining ranks. And NATO was kind of a military alliance without a mission. And I think now they have a mission. And they're putting a lot of money in, a lot of arms into Ukraine. They're not going to go in themselves. But Putin has been playing his game of trying to split up the EU and the EU from the US a long time. I mean, we now know that Putin helped to fund the Brexit campaign. Now, I'm not saying that Britain left purely because of Putin gave X million dollars to the Brexit campaign, but we know this is what he does, in addition to funding radicals, extreme right-wingers, left-wingers in Europe to foment extremism. And the weak link right now, and I'll call them in tomorrow's Wednesday, the weekend Berkshire Eagle on Germany. And the weak link is Germany for the moment. The prime ministers separately of the UK, Poland, and Holland, and Netherlands, all went to Kyiv last week. And Poland, the UK, and Ukraine are forming an alliance, whatever that means. They're sending in military aid and large amounts of military aid. And Germany is going to send 5,000 helmets.
Right.
And not helmets, helmets for your head, not helmut.
I heard one Ukrainian said, what are they going to send next? Pillows?
They're going to send a field hospital.
Oh, okay. What do you make, as somebody asked, of Zelensky and others in Ukraine saying, don't worry, don't panic, you're ratcheting this up to the West. You're making this seem much greater than it is. What do you make of what their game plan is, or their rationale for that kind of tamping down?
Just to quickly digress, I remember I was in, when I was covering South Korea, there were times when Kim Jong-il was really threatening. And I remember my Korean friends are kind of saying, yeah, well, here it is again. And they just lived with the threat of the North Koreans threatening to turn Seoul into a sea of fire for 5 years. And after a while, you just sort of get on with your life. To some degree, I think Ukrainians are there in that space. I think Zelensky would sort of like to have it both ways. He doesn't want to have his currency radically devalued and, international interest rates go soaring for Ukraine, bond rates becoming more expensive. Foreign investors, I'm afraid, really are few and far between these days. So he'd sort of like to have the military aid, but not all the scary talk. There are a lot of people in Ukraine who say he's taking the wrong tack, including the leading opposition man who Zelensky is trying to throw in jail, who was the prior president, who says, no, we need a national mobilization and we can't kid around with this. So I think Zelensky is sort of trying to have the best of both worlds, get the Western aid and support, but not scare the bond markets and the foreign exchange markets and that sort of thing.
And how do you, we've had a lot of questions about the role of the US and NATO in this. Putin says he wants ironclad guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, push back the military installations to 1994 places, installations, and he wants this buffer, this sphere of influence. What is that a fair, or
well, that's what he wants.
Have a sphere of influence?
That's what he wants, and he wants to. And there's this phrase Finlandization, which basically, under the threat of becoming a Soviet republic, Finland tread a very careful neutral path after World War II. The Ukrainians are not there. I mean, there are 40 million of them who want to live like Europeans. Now, maybe he can take the place over and reprogram them, but it will not be a happy place. They do not want to be part of Russia. And they've made that quite clear. Putin will often say that, oh, you promised at the collapse of the Berlin Wall that, you wouldn't move NATO east. Well, Secretary of State James Baker, in an interview with Peter Baker of the New York Times, no relation, said, yes, I made that offer verbally in the first round of what turned out to be 10 rounds of negotiations. And after I made that offer, I went back to Washington and I was chewed out. That offer was never became concrete, was never in paper. What we do know is that Russia and the UK and the US and Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. It will surprise our listeners that in 1994, Ukraine was the world's third largest nuclear power. And in a great piece of diplomacy, we persuaded them to give up their nuclear weapons, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan. And Ukraine sent all their nuclear weapons back to Russia in exchange for a piece of paper where Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, 20 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine. You can say, too bad for Russia. Au contraire, too bad for the world, because Americans may not know about the Budapest Memorandum, but the Iranians do, and the North Koreans do, and they may not want to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for a piece of paper. So that's where we are, that Russia signed on the dotted line, we will respect the borders of Ukraine, and 20 years later, they invaded. And there are people inside Ukraine, it's not going to go anywhere, who said we should build nuclear weapons again to keep the Russians off our backs.
And then, so President Biden has made the statement that he does not want to see American troops inside Ukraine. And so what are the options? And we're seeing them on a daily basis, but everybody's saying we don't negotiate in public. But there has been a lot of negotiations with the United States, but also with Macron going to both capitals and others. But what are the options short of? And this, there's so many questions here, Jim. But
Yeah.
the other one is there are different kinds of attacks. He's obviously, with all of his ships and tanks and 100,000 troops, threatening an invasion. But there are different kinds of attacks as well.
Yeah.
And so,
well, as I said at the outset, John, there are these sort of kind of invisible attacks. I mean, if you look at your map and you blockade all the blue, you strangle Ukraine. I mean, they won't have international trade. They do have railroad lines going to the west, but as I said, 80% of their trade goes by ship. And Ukraine is one of the top 5 world food powers for exporting grain and wheat and corn, wheat, and the world's largest producer of sunflower oil. There'll be a lot of unhappy people cook with sunflower oil. But that's one thing. You can strangle the country. You can launch cyber attacks. You can demoralize through all sorts of disinformation campaigns, through Facebook and the internet. You can bomb isolated concentrations of Ukrainian troops that's kind of out of sight and out of mind. And you can put a lot of pressure on Ukraine. You could temporarily occupy a chunk, which would sort of humiliate the Ukrainian president. There's a little island, as shown on your map, called Snake Island. And they could claim that was liberated by it's on the mouth of the Danube, down in the corner there. And yeah, exactly, a little bit, yeah, just mouth of the Danube. And they could claim that was liberated by Soviet troops in 1944 and should never be part of Ukraine. And the Romanians said it was part of Romania and blah, 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 blah. And they could grab that. And then they basically could almost string a chain, like a chain across the Hudson River during the Revolutionary War, and block the Black Sea ports, once again, strangling. Now, a diplomatic outcome, the neutrality thing sounds great on paper, but Ukraine went down that road. Ukraine was neutral and was attacked by Russia in 2014. And now Russia occupies 7% of Ukrainian territory. So what the Ukrainians don't want to see is what you call the salami tactics. Okay, you got 7%. Well, we'll just give you Kharkiv or, a couple other Russian-speaking cities. We'd be happy with that. Or, even the east coast of the river, the Dnipro River. So they want real security guarantees. And Putin says, oh, I need security guarantees too. If you looked at the number of tanks in NATO these days, it's pathetic. It's like maybe 2,000. Russia has 20,000 tanks, Germany is a paper tiger. It's waiting for someone to call their bluff. The German army is 65,000 people. The Russian army is 900,000, And at some point, and that's why Putin is kind of strutting his stuff, because he can, be the bully on the beach and kick sand in everyone's face. So this is where we are. And he's that country above Ukraine, you see Belarus, the dictator stole the election about 2 years ago, and Lukashenko, and went running to Putin for help. And so in return, Belarus is basically the westernmost region of Russia. It's no longer really an independent country. And they have, for these exercises, they have 30,000 Russian troops inside Belarus, joint military command, but really responding to the Russian Western Military District. And next in line is Moldova or, Poland. I mean, I read a quote by Adolf Hitler, and he said this in a speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin in 1938. After I take the Sudetenland, I have no more territorial ambitions in Europe. After I take Crimea, I won't ask for anything more. So that's where we are.
And we did have a question from somebody just about that, making that comparison. Why wasn't there greater uproar around the world when Putin annexed Crimea, and they had this election in Crimea? Where would you rather be, part of Russia or Ukraine? And the thinking of this one questioner was, because it was such a mild response in 2014, Putin sees 8 years later that he might get away with another similar.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, John. I agree with the questioner. It blindsided a lot of people. I hate to say it, but 2 months before the invasion, I did write that it was possible. And I got roundly attacked inside Ukraine. How can you say that happened? That, how that we'd lose Crimea? Well, it happened. And Crimea had a special dynamic. It was actually, and I don't mean to digress, but in the Soviet system, the guys would kind of game the system. So their last posting would be in Crimea. It's kind of like retiring to Florida. And so these guys, Russian Navy guys and Russian Army guys, would kind of work it out. So their last post was Sevastopol or somewhere. So there are a lot of ethnic Russians who were very nostalgic for the Soviet system and period, and they were down there in Crimea. The plebiscite was a fraud, but that said, probably a majority of registered voters would have gone for going into Russian rule, but that doesn't say that you should have elections taken in an environment where there's no free press and there are 30,000 Russian troops occupying an area. So it did blindside a lot of people. And then I do think what really emboldened Putin was our debacle in Afghanistan, where the whole place fell like a deck of cards in the space of 6 weeks. And that was noticed in Moscow, and it was noticed and it was commented upon. And there were these people taunting in the official press saying, Ukraine, you're next. The Americans are not going to come and help you. Tough luck. So.
Yeah. Can you, let's go back to the NATO and all the negotiations now. Can you shed light on these different Minsk agreements that have come about? heard last night that Emmanuel Macron is trying to revive Minsk II.
Yeah, it'd be nice. Minsk was basically negotiated at gunpoint. It was negotiated when there were about 3,000 Ukrainian troops surrounded, and the then president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, had to sign a ceasefire. And a little footnote, they negotiated after signing this, they negotiated a safe corridor for the Ukrainian troops to go to Ukrainian land. And then Putin ordered these guys to be wiped out. And it was one of the worst debacles of Ukrainian military history. They lost several hundred, well, hundreds of men easily. So that leaves Minsk gives Ukrainians a bad taste about Minsk. The Minsk protocols, and by the time I got to Ukraine, people sort of stopped focusing on them. But the problem was they were to give not only autonomy to the Russian-controlled sections of eastern Ukraine, but also to give them not only nothing more giving them seats in the parliament, but to give them veto power over foreign policy. So that would kind of be tying the hands of the rest of the nation. 5% of the nation in population would be telling the other 95% what they could do and could not do. And meanwhile, Putin, he has this very clever policy called the passportization. He's handed out 600,000 Russian passports to 600,000 Ukrainians living in these occupied areas. So that gives him a justification. Oh, I got to invade to protect my own people. And he's always looking for what's called a false flag, a pretext for invasion. And the Russians, the Soviets have done this, and the Tsars did it too. It's not a new invention. So you got a situation where about half of the people living in areas under Russian control now have Russian passports. So they're almost not Ukrainian anymore, at least on paper they're not. They may have a Ukrainian passport hidden in the bedroom drawer somewhere. And by the way, when President Zelensky was elected about 3 years ago, who is a native Russian speaker, who speaks okay Ukrainian, but he grew up speaking Russian. When he came to power, he reached out to Putin, and he reached out to these areas, and he set up these sort of nice, crossing areas where there were, heated toilets and ATM machines and pharmacies and buses and all this nice stuff. And Putin responded simply by turning into a border with North Korea. I mean, the crossings in this line of control dropped from like 1 million a month to about 1,000 a month. Before Putin lowered the boom, there was fairly free movement back and forth, not comfortable, but movement back and forth, mainly from Ukrainian pensioners going across the border to go to a Ukrainian bank ATM. So he took a very hard line on that one and really has isolated these people. And they're not, they may regret the choice. They didn't make really a choice, but they may regret the situation. And once again, half the population is gone. It's the dead hand of communism, essentially. That's not communism, but gangsterism. Where I think a third of the population has gone to Russia, a third has gone to Ukraine proper, and the other third stay there. And most of them are pensioners who stay there because they have a roof over their heads. So enough of that.
Someone asked about timing. Why now? And you addressed that. You think it has a fair amount to do with what they were looking at in Afghanistan. But Putin's been emboldened as well in his military excursions in Syria and in Kazakhstan, where he's been very successful using the Russian army. And so this is a different kettle of fish, but I'm wondering if you think this is the next step of using this vast military machine for his purposes.
Yeah, I mean, we've really moved, far. I remember after the 2008 invasion of Georgia, the New York Times military correspondent, who really knew what he was talking about, analyzed the Russian military and just said it was kind of held together with bobby pins, the commanders using cell phones to talk to each other, sort of thing. That's all history. And when I was the VOA, Voice of America bureau chief in Moscow, which was 2010 to 2014, I remember doing stories like, oh, isn't it interesting, Russia is rebuilding their rust bucket navy. That was a kind of phrase that people love to say. Well, it was naive because we didn't really think they were going to build up a serious. And I remember the Russians offered to give me access to go to Kaliningrad to look at their Iskander missiles they're setting up in Kaliningrad, which is that little exclave between Poland and Lithuania. And VOA watched, oh, don't bother, it's not a story. Well, these are nuclear capable missiles that the Russians wanted to show me in Kaliningrad. I mean, yes, it was a story, but I didn't go. So it's not your grandmother's Russian army. It is a fearsome fighting force. It's been rebuilt, and I think he's itching to use it. Oh, John, answer a little bit of that question. There's a little, once again, when Zelensky was elected, which was something that never happens in Russia, but a complete dark horse outsider won, as I said, native Russian speaker. There was a sort of honeymoon, and there were some political prisoners released from the concentration camps in the Russian-controlled area. And then Zelensky kind of gave up on Putin and turned on Putin's main man in Ukraine, a guy called Viktor Medvedchuk, who was sort of a sinister character. His father had actually worked with the Nazis, selecting people to work in the occupied areas of Germany in the slave labor factories. Medvedchuk was considered politically unacceptable by the Soviets, so he became a KGB informer at the law school. That's the only way to get into law school in Kyiv. And he proceeded to not defend Ukrainian poets and nationalists. Actually, I visited the cell where a Ukrainian poet defended by Medvedchuk died, beaten up in a Perm concentration camp. But anyhow, Medvedchuk, a man of cat of 10 lives, had become the leader of the pro-Russian segment of the parliament of Ukraine. It's kind of hard to imagine. You can imagine Jefferson Davis having his own block inside the United States Congress in 1861. But anyhow, there he was. And he's the only man who actually could fly up to Moscow. And his daughter was the goddaughter of Vladimir Putin. So they're all chummy. And I don't have to elaborate how much. Well, Zelensky turned on this guy about a year ago in February and shut down there were these pro-Russian TV stations. He shut them down and confiscated some of his properties. His wife had an oil company that actually was selling gasoline to the Russian army in the occupied areas. The whole thing was very murky. So Zelensky, partly for his own political reasons, just took this guy off the chessboard. When that happened, I think Putin said, forget it. The political solution is not viable. There's no future in that. We're going to have to use military pressure.
Wow, very personal. So taking a step back, what it looks like is that there are all these and uses of the diplomatic channel in order to reduce this threat along the border. But every time there are forays made diplomatically, whether it's by the Americans or the French or the Germans, Putin escalates. He started these war games in Belarus. You mentioned tonight, he's putting a blockade. It looks like it could be a complete blockade. And each time he's not backing down. In fact, he's responding to negotiations by ramping it up even further. Is there an out for Putin here that is short of military invasion?
Everyone's looking for this famous exit ramp, and frankly, I don't see it. I would like to see it. I do not want to see a city I love, Kyiv, to be bombed. I don't want to see Ukraine invaded. I don't want to see Ukraine becoming another Yugoslavia with some 10-year war. I'm not, is it Vladimir the Rational or a Mad Vlad? And I'm not quite sure which we're dealing with. I do think that Putin will go right up to the knife's edge, right up to the brinkmanship. And then he may not even made up his own mind, but it's all up to him. And I think it's probably 60-40 that there will be a military attack on Ukraine.
And that could be, as you were mentioning earlier, doesn't have to be all out war using their advantages in air power and others. They could do it a number
Yeah,
of.
I mean, I'm looking at your map again, and if you look at this little city of Kerch, it's down the southern tip. The Sea of Azov, yeah, right down there, below Berdyansk. And I mean, just to show you how they're playing the long game, they built a bridge because the neck of the isthmus has been closed off to Crimea from Ukraine proper. The Russians built a bridge, didn't really ask anyone's permission, but they did it. They built it too low, deliberately. So about a third of the freighters that would go in through there to Mariupol to take out steel from Ukraine's largest steel complex couldn't get in there. And the first couple of weeks, some of these freighters actually taking down their radar masts and squeeze underneath this bridge. Russians know how to build bridges. If anyone's been to St. Petersburg, there's this wonderful thing at maybe 2:00 in the morning, they raise the bridges to let the boats go in and out of up and down the Lena, the river there, the Neva River. They deliberately built a low bridge to bottle up Ukraine in the Sea of Azov, which legally is a binational body of water. It's a factoid. It's the world's shallowest sea. It's only about 20 meters deep or something. But, it's a lifeline for that corner of Ukraine. And they deliberately, with cement and steel, reduced. And of course, Ukrainian Navy ships no longer can go in there. They have to kind of bring them in by rail or something. I bring that up because this is part of the long plan that Putin had we're going to put the squeeze on Ukraine. We're going to make them scream, put the squeeze on, and maybe they'll cry uncle and come back to Mother Russia. What was that phrase that he used? Like it or not, my beauty, you have to put up with it. Charming.
Oh, terrible. And so somebody asked just a very specific question: where are these 100,000 plus troops massed?
Well, the easiest thing is we know there are 30,000 in Belarus. These are for exercises started yesterday and are to end February 20th. And by the way, I don't know whether the CIA was asleep or what, but the invasion of Georgia took place the day after similar exercises ended in the Caucasus. And there were like 1,000 armored personnel carriers and tanks all lined up north of Georgia. And for some reason, that information didn't really percolate down to Tbilisi. So exercises, after the exercises, watch this space, essentially, Belarus. And then they're kind of circling all the way around the Russia part. Crimea is sort of an armed aircraft carrier. It's a fortress. Those are not, I wouldn't consider those part of the 130,000 troops. The special troops that have been moved in from as far away as Siberia. I mean, this is a big deal. These things have come in by train, takes a long time. And what's interesting is that many of them they're not on the border. They're big concentrations. The pictures you'll see in the paper online, they're maybe 50 kilometers into Russia. And the reason for that is the Ukrainians have very good missile systems that could hurt them if they were closer. The Ukrainians claim, and I think it's true, that they built the ICBMs that threatened the United States until 1991. So they have a very long and proven record for rocketry, and they make their own. So the Russians are not stupid. They're staying maybe 100 clicks back from Russia where they feel they're out of range.
And so short of, or a response to any or some kind of military incursion, we've talked about economic sanctions that the world has never seen before, but then we unleash an economic war. Russia holds cards as well in retaliation. Can you talk about the consequences and what the
a couple
options
things.
are?
I ask our viewers, what Russian products do you have in your house? Your cell phone? No. Your car? No. Your TV? No. What bottle of vodka? Maybe. Maybe it's Polish. If you're European, what you have in your house is Russian molecules of gas. And that is the Achilles heel of the EU. 40% of Europe's gas imports come from Russia. Now, during the Soviet era, most of them crossed Ukraine. Ukraine has this big pipe system, which is only running at about 25% capacity. Over the summer, Putin, what happened was there was an economic recovery. A lot of LNG cargoes were diverted to Asia, and Gazprom complied with their contracts, but did not answer Europe's appeals for more gas. And so Europe's gas reservoirs are at historic lows, and some of them are as low as like 30%. We're in February. They need the gas to stay warm and to generate their electricity. And meanwhile, for better or worse, after Fukushima, Japan, the Germans turned off all their nuclear power plants. And solar and wind are turning out to be more seasonal than was expected. So Europe's Achilles heel is this gas dependency on Russia. There is gas coming up from Algeria and Libya, but not enough. There is gas coming down from Norway and Holland, but not enough. There is LNG. In fact, Japan offered to forego several LNG cargoes, and now they're being rerouted to to Rotterdam. What is sinister, or what is disturbing, is that for the first time in history, Russia has anchored off Kaliningrad, an LNG we reconstitute LNG into the gas form, gasification, a floating gasification terminal. That is in case they have to cut off gas, or they feel that is in case they cut off gas to all of Europe. They will be able to heat Kaliningrad. So they've already pre-positioned this gasification vessel at Kaliningrad, which can take LNG cargoes and take care of them. But the big issue was this $11 billion, 1,500-mile pipeline along the Baltic seabed from near St. Petersburg to Angela Merkel's home district in eastern Germany, called the Nord Stream 2. And that would make the whole Ukraine pipeline system irrelevant, redundant, and which many people were warning, including myself, that this would untie Putin's hands to attack Ukraine. I mean, the thinking is that if he has to send gas across Ukraine, he's dependent, he has to make nice to Ukraine. Without that dependency, he does not have to play nice. The Germans went ahead and built this thing. It has not been approved. And this is where the new German chancellor has to kind of step up to the plate and say that commissioning this pipeline and the use of it is contingent on peace in Ukraine. Now, President Biden on Monday in Washington, with the German chancellor standing next to him, said, if Russia invades Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 is dead. And then reporters turned to the German chancellor and said, well, Herr Scholz, what do you say? And he kind of muffled and bumbled and didn't say specifically what he refused to use the phrase Nord Stream 2 and said that we'll do things by consensus. The Munich Security Conference, which is an annual wingding for security people, will be in Munich starting a week from tomorrow. And everyone will be listening to see what this German chancellor has to say, because that could keep the Russians at bay. $11 billion pipeline, if he says, if you invade, we'll just put the cork in it, that probably could stop them, I believe.
And other sanctions because of this amassing of foreign exchange, and somebody had earlier asked, where did they get all this foreign exchange? Putin can ride out sanctions.
Well, and he's made a pile because the price of gas in the EU has increased 8-fold this year in the last 12 months. I mean, he is raking in the money. So, war scares can be profitable, and by shorting his customers can be profitable. Now, where he's going to lose is Europeans may not remember their history very well, but they will not forget this, and they will start working on alternatives. This is a real wake-up call to the current generation that Russia is not a reliable supplier. Russia did not come through with the additional gas that the EU needs. The EU is short. The price is going through the roof. There's been a transfer of billions of dollars from west to east, and Ukrainian politicians do want to be caught in that situation again. What can be done if indeed we see next week that freighters, and the Chinese are the number one trading partner of Ukraine. The Chinese need Ukrainian corn. India is the number one buyer of Ukrainian sunflower oil and sunflower seeds. China buys massive amounts of iron ore. If these freighters start heading up through the Dardanelles to Ukraine and they're stopped by a Russian Navy picket line, the response would be to bar entry to all Russian civilian ships to world ports. That's kind of a no-brainer. But there has to be a quid. Putin doesn't do nice. He's a guy who grew up fighting on the streets of St. Petersburg. He's a judo player, and he doesn't believe in please and thank you. He believes in the punch in the nose, essentially.
You bring up China, and we had a couple of questions about China and this recent very public meeting at the Olympics between Putin and Xi Jinping. What do you make of that? How does that play into the Ukraine?
Well, as I said, China is the number one trading partner now of Ukraine, and maybe Poland or Germany is second, and Russia's been kind of brought down to third place. I think it was disconcerting. And the Chinese, as I said, are watching how the West will respond to anything Russia does in Ukraine. This isn't like Nazi Germany and Japan in 1941. The Russians, Putin has really cultivated apparently he's met with him 30 times. Russia and China have the world's largest land border. I think it's maybe US, Canada, but it's like number 1 or 2. Russia is totally defenseless against China. So he's been working, and now he's been in power for 20 years. He's been working very hard on cultivating the Chinese. That said, there's no love lost between the Russian people and the Chinese people. I hate to be blunt, but the Russians can be quite racist, and to their dismay, they've been surpassed economically by the Chinese, which is not supposed to happen according to their racial worldview. And so that I never forget going to a modern art show, And there was a picture which probably couldn't be displayed these days in Moscow today. And there's a picture of the Red Square, in Moscow, and all these Chinese PLA soldiers basically copulating on a square with blonde women. And this is kind of, in the background. And if you go to I've been to twice to the Russian Military Museum in Habbaros, which is in the Russian Far East. It's right across the river from China. And it's mandatory that every Russian NCO serving the Russian Far East go through this museum. And the centerpiece is this mural, and it shows this blonde woman holding up a cross, and they're basically on a hill, and they're kind of massacring the savages, the Orientals that are coming up the hill. I mean, it's really. And then when you go to Nahodka, which is the industrial port of Vladivostok, there's this huge billboard, and there's a sort of blonde woman with her bread and salt, and it says, "Здесь начинается Europa." Europe starts here. So I bring this up because it's an alliance of convenience, which may go just so far. The Chinese leadership, after the big Putin meeting of last week, kind of signal that this isn't really an alliance. It isn't sort of a military alliance. It's sort of we each have our own interests here. It's something to watch, but the Chinese are definitely watching the Western response to Ukraine. And if we kind of step on the ball and mumble and don't do anything, it's a green light to grab Taiwan.
Yeah, so they see this in two ways. One is with an eye towards Taiwan, but they also have their own economic interests tied to Ukraine as well. So it's a cognitive
The Chinese are very mercantilist, they don't want disruptions. If they've signed 10-year contracts for delivery of corn, they want the corn to come, and they're very sensitive about food prices, obviously. And so the number one export of Ukraine to China is food.
Uh-huh.
In fact, the number one export of Ukraine is food. It's the breadbasket of Europe. That's why the Nazis wanted it.
Well, one thing, Jim, that has impressed me, and I'm sure everybody on the call, is the depth of your knowledge that I'm sure comes from living in this region for so many years. But people have asked, how can we stay informed? What do you read to stay abreast of what's going on over there now?
Yeah, well, actually was trying to check out, but it's not letting me go. I stopped doing my newsletter December 24, and I've sort of been enjoying life. And then now I find that everyone wants me to give a little guidance on what's happening in Ukraine. And I sincerely, I love the people, love the country, love Kyiv, where I lived for 6 years. There's a newspaper called the Kyiv Independent. Let me just grab a little show and tell. During my entire time, actually, I went to Ukraine to be the CEO of this Kyiv Post. Make a long story short, the government basically leaned very heavily on the owner and shut it down last October. And it still continues in sort of a rump form. But the heart of the matter is the whole newsroom. Most of them went to do this independent news site called the Kyiv Independent, and I find that to be a good source of information.
And that's in English.
It's in English, right? Yeah.
Do you think there's cyber attacks already underway in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's just bread and butter. I have no idea why we just sort of let these cyber attacks happen. I mean, and they cost huge amounts of money. I have an American friend who owns an advertising agency in Kyiv. And when the NotPetya virus attack hit about 3 summers ago, he had like 5 silos and they weren't connected. So he lost maybe 2 silos of information. this is real money. It's millions of man hours and women hours to replace this. And for some reason, our government doesn't really respond, but the people interested in cybersecurity see Ukraine as kind of front line, and the Russians, did turn off the power in a couple of cases. So now they've shown they know how to do that. One thing I didn't mention, for better or worse, because the Ukrainians have been fighting on the front lines against the Russians, there are a fair number of U.S. Army and military observers who go down there on a fairly regular basis. And I did watch online a lecture by West Point, and the U.S. has learned a lot about Russian tactics and capabilities by observing what's going on in Ukraine. So it's been a learning experience for the military and for the cybersecurity people.
Yeah, we had a question on Ukrainian Air Force. Would they just be, is there one? Would they just be overwhelmed by?
Yeah, John, I mean, what Ukraine needs is anti-drone, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft missiles. And Britain sent a couple of plane loads, but the Germans felt kind of uncomfortable about that. So the RAF planes had to like fly around German airspace. I don't know who's going to defend Germany when the time comes. But anyhow, the Ukrainian Air Force, a lot of it's a Soviet legacy stuff, which are crashing on their own. The Russians have really fearsome anti-aircraft systems, probably as good as the US anti-aircraft systems. And there was a couple of terrible tragedies where in the early part of 2014, like June 2014, they managed to shoot down a transport filled with soldiers. And then, and Russia, I think, still tries to deny it, but this Buk anti-aircraft system blew out of the air 2 miles up the Malaysian Airlines flight in the summer of 2014, killing, I think, about 250 people. So these people were flying from Amsterdam to Malaysia, and there they were up 2 miles up, reading their cell phones or whatever, and they're just blown out of the air by an anti-aircraft missile. And initially, the separatists, which are really controlled by the Russians, thought they'd hit a Ukrainian aircraft, military aircraft, but they didn't, and they killed about 250 people. So I think if there's an attack, the Air Force will not do too much. They'll be very, very careful because the anti-aircraft weaponry is so fearsome. And the Ukrainian Navy either defected to Russia in 2014, some of it came back, but it's really, they've been trying to build this Mosquito Navy, which would be a little bit what the Iranians have, these speedboats with very powerful missiles, even shoulder-held missiles. And these things could bomb around the Black Sea and the sea was off at high speed and knock out Russian Navy ships. And I'm not so sure how far they've gotten with that. The U.S. has sent some sort of Coast Guard surplus ships. The French are building some fast boats. The U.S. Seabees have actually built the new Ukrainian Naval Forces Command because the old one was stolen by the Russians in Crimea. So there has been some effort to be sort of small, agile, and smart. And, with the Soviet era, they inherited battle cruisers that were supposed to go to Somalia or something. They didn't need that stuff.
Thanks. And this might be a good question. A good last question is, how would you rate the U.S. media coverage of what's going on now? And the person who asked this, especially in light of some of the coverage that has been very critical of 20 years ago in the lead up to the Iraq War?
Well, I think, there are not that many correspondents based in Kyiv. Most of the reporters have been coming down from Moscow. For instance, the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think, has someone in part-time in Kyiv. I think it's pretty realistic. There's not, first of all, the people worry about Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, Biden has just said outright, we're not sending American troops. The Ukrainians don't want American troops. They do want American weapons, yes, stingers, that sort of thing. I think, the Ukrainians, it's a Western society. Many speak English, many don't. The reporters coming down from Russia generally speak Russian. I think it's been pretty good, frankly. I don't think it's been overly sensational. I think, we don't want to sleepwalk into a war, not being aware of what's happening. So I don't, if people are worried there's going to be another Iraq or something, that's just not in the cards, because we're not going to send American troops there. But American weaponry, yeah. So I don't have a big bone to pick with my erstwhile colleagues in the press.
Good. Well, Jim, this has really been quite excellent, and your fount of information has really informed us all. A lot of comments in the chat thanking you for the depth of your knowledge and sharing it so easily at your fingertips. We had one person on who said she was Ukrainian and said she agreed with everything you said. And so that's a very good sign as well. But again, I really appreciate your taking the time to give us and lend us your background. These are tough times, and it's good for all of us to be as well informed as we can be on this. So,
John, thank you. And I have seen flashing below names of friends of mine, Glenn Fukushima and others sending in questions. So hello to everyone out there. And a big thanks to you, John, and to Megan and the Oli group for setting us up. It's really a wonderful forum. I think we had about 1,000 people signed up. It was a pretty large group. And hopefully we'll get through this. The latest thinking is this is going to be a long slog. So I'm hoping this isn't the beginning of Yugoslavia, which would be terrible.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Megan. I don't know if you have anything else. Otherwise, we'll just sign off from here.
Great. Thank you both so much. And as I noted in chat, this will be recorded and sent to everyone who registered, and you're welcome to share it with others as well. Thank you both so much, and have a good night.
Yeah, one last thing.
Sure.
If people want to contact me, I'm at Jim Brooke Ukraine at Gmail, and that's JIMBROOKE, Jim Brooke Ukraine at gmail.com. So I know there were like 100 questions, and John did a great job of summarizing them. So I'll sign off with that. Time for dinner. Great, thanks.
All right, take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. I'll put the email in the email address in the email tomorrow. For
Good
folks.
deal. Great.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good night, everybody.